say to you that I see after my sermon this morning, you are actually going to be reciting the principles of the Christian church, which is one of the four streams that makes up the United Church of Christ. It is we have four traditions on our side. There's the German Reformed, of which you're part of. There's the Evangelical Synod, which I pastored. The last church I pastored was the Evangelical Synod in Chicago. There's the Christian Church, which is a smaller denomination that comes out of the Carolinas and Tennessee. And of course, our congregational brothers and sisters, the Pilgrims and the Puritans. Those are the four traditions that make up the United Church of Christ. So it was wonderful to see those particular principles of the Christian church being actually said there as well. So friends, I bring you greetings on behalf of the 151 churches of our conference and the staff of the Pennsylvania Southeast Conference of the United Church of Christ. At our best, the conference is that link that connects our church's various and diverse ministries, both locally and globally. And together, in our best moments, of course, we provide our local churches, our pastors, and our congregations with the training and inspiration they need to carry out our church's wider mission. Of course, we're always stronger together, and therefore we embrace diversity, and above all, we spread the good news of God's love for all. My name is Kevin McLemore, and I am your Associate Conference Minister for Search and Call. I have been in the position a little over 2 years now. For that, I pastored 24 years elsewhere in different settings of the church, big churches, small churches, lots of kinds of different churches. I want to thank you and John for allowing me to sort of bring a word to you from the scriptures this morning and to meet with some of your folks about your search for a new pastor. I'm excited for you as you begin that new search, and I think you are doubly blessed, having roots both in the Lutheran tradition as well as in the United Church of Christ. So Jerry Zaslaw was a writer of a column in the Wall Street Journal called Moving On. He focused on life transitions, everything from a child's first crush to a dying husband's last words to his wife, which I think is an odd thing for a financially oriented newspaper like the Journal. Sadly, he passed away in a car accident in 2012 in Michigan. But back in the 2000s, the mid-2000s, he wrote a column on the power and the resiliency of women's friendships with each other. He wrote this: the column focused on why women, more than men, have great urges to hold on tightly to old friends. Sociologists now have data showing that women who can maintain friendships through the decades are healthier and happier with strong marriages. Not all women are able to sustain those friendships, however. It's true that countless grade school girls arrange themselves in pairs, duos, and foursomes and threesomes, vowing to be best friends forever. But of course, as they reach adulthood, everything gets harder. Between ages 25 and 40, women's friendships are most at risk because those are the years when women are often consumed with marrying and raising children and establishing careers. For that column, Zaslow continues here, I spoke to women who had nurtured decades-long friendships. They said they felt like traveling companions, sharing the same point on the timeline, hitting the same milestones together, 30, 40, 50, 80. They believed their friendships thrived because they had raised some expectations and lowered others. They had come to expect loyalty and good wishes from each other, but not constant attention. If a friend didn't return an email or a phone call, they realized it didn't mean she was angry or she was backing away from the friendship. She was just likely exhausted from her day. Researchers who study friendships say that if women are still friends at age 40, there's a strong likelihood they'll be lifelong friends. Female friends show up as mirrors of ourselves, one researcher told me. Now, it was after that, writing that column, that Zaslow received an email from a woman called Jenny, who shared with the columnist her own story of a 40-year friendship she had with some other women from their hometown of Ames, Iowa. These young women had grown up in the 60s. They lived as young women in the 80s, started having children in the 90s, and had forged lifelong friendships with each other through good times and bad. They had supported each other. They had cried with each other. They shared happiness and pain with each other, and it had made life more livable, more meaningful, more rich because of how they had cared for each other. For them, friendship was not something you picked up and put down. It was something you took on and carried with you for the rest of your life, even when the burden of that friendship was sometimes difficult. Well, after receiving this email from Jenny, Zaslow simply wrote her a quick note thanking her and just printed out the email and filed it away with dozens and dozens of other emails from women who had written about their own friendships with other women. It was only years later, in the late 2000s, that Zaslow picked up those printed emails again and decided to re-explore this issue of women's friendship. It was interesting when I read some interviews with him recently. He said the reason why he did this was that he was in a household of women. He had a wife, he had all daughters. He was just fascinated with the ways that women connect with each other. And so he did this re-exploration through that group of friends from Ames, Iowa. So back in 2009, he wrote a book called The Girls from Ames, a story of women and friendship. Really good book if you want something to read that's both meaningful and powerful, whether you're a man or a woman. I do say it's interesting, one of the things that's a challenge for men oftentimes is friendship. We know that. Historically, men have struggled with those lifelong friendships and closeness. So my fascination with women's friendships, I think in many ways, it goes back to that, to see as a man, how do I keep those friendships, those lifelong friendships strong? Now, what also fascinated me most about this story about these women from Ames was how incarnational it was, right? It's a fancy word about God's incarnating, God being with us in human flesh, how profoundly human it was. To hear these women's stories of deep friendship and loyalty to each other, there's something about the human self, right? The human soul that craves companionship, friendship, people to go on the journey with, a connection to other human beings. And it seems to me that the way we humans really get at that truth or stumble upon that truth is that we come to know in our bones, in our own human experiences through human stories, right? We come to know truth that way. We experience truth. We don't know truth. We know truth, right? I always kid about the fact that when I preach a sermon, I know that people usually do not remember the central theme that I was trying to get across, but they always remember the stories I told to make that point, the illustration I used to make my point. When I begin to tell a story, people immediately start paying attention again, even if their eyes have glazed over, and I've done plenty of that, and have plenty of you in the pews just glaze over when I start talking, even if their eyes have been that way a bunch of the sermon. I think that is because we learn, and we live our lives amid stories that we're actually living out or that we're telling, and that is the why we pay attention to them when they are being told to us. We recognize them as the very means by which we come to learn truths about our own very lives and about God. That's why the Old Testament and New Testament are full of stories about God. And what we often find the most meaningful parts of the Bible are the stories of Jesus, right? Stories, right? That is why books like The Girl from Ames and other moments of human connection matter so much. They connect us to what really matters. These human stories, these truths given flesh and bone, given a story by our own experience or the experience of others. And that is why stories like the one we have before us today from the Bible really matter. They embody truth. They tell us the truth, a truth that we can recognize, a truth that has flesh and blood, that we can touch, a truth we can run our hands over and through. And that is why the incarnation matters, right? This idea that God came to us in flesh and blood through the Christ. That is why the Christian church has tried to articulate in its own fumbling way, a way of understanding God that was familiar, not distant, not foreign, but an understanding that was as real as the person you are sitting next to right now in the pew. For the most part, it's been a disaster because in reality, how does one really give voice to this deepest of mysteries, the mystery of God-given flesh and bone in this Christ? I mean, we Christians, we just spend a lot of time arguing over the minutiae, right? The details, and you forget the big picture, which is really the story, I hate to say, of Christian theology as a whole for the last 2,000 years. We argue over the details, we miss the big points. But in our text today, it's all very simplified. You have a mystery distilled, though it's not found in some sort of creed, it's not found in a theology book, but in a simple story about this resurrected one, who who arrives amidst his frightened friends. Remember, he calls them friends in John. And he shows them how alive he is, how real he is, as real as he ever was or will ever be. Now, startled and terrified, they find themselves in his presence again, just as the ones who had told them of their encounter with him on that road to Emmaus. They fear he's a ghost, like he cannot be, right? They fear he's maybe even just a figment of their imagination, but he presents, and this is interesting, his nail-scarred hands and his feet to show them how he really is. It's interesting that even in this resurrected body, he comes back with scars. So real was he that the wreckage of the nails that were wrought on his hands were still there. And even then, amidst their joy, they still can't imagine that it's him. That the one they saw crucified, if from a safe distance, out of cowardice, is the same one who is with them in that room. I mean, just to make a point here, Jesus asked for food, something to eat, because it was a truism in the ancient world that ghosts weren't able to eat and digest food. So he eats a piece of boiled fish with them, to their amazement, their quiet amazement. But why was it so important for them to see that Jesus wasn't a ghost? I mean, I don't know if Jesus coming back as a ghost would have been any less amazing, really, right? I think one of the reasons is found in what I said earlier. That we humans find our truths, our personal truths, and the truths that God graciously gives us, that we find these truths on this side of eternity in the world of flesh and blood, in these bodies made of dust and spit, as the Genesis story tells us, right? It's on this side of eternity where we're going to encounter God, meet God, struggle with God, be supported by God. We will learn these lessons on this side of eternity, and the lessons we learn or don't learn are the ones that are likely to stick with us into eternity. So it was important for Jesus, as the one who is like us human beings, who is God's love given flesh and bone, God's love given flesh and bone, to show his disciples then and now that he was like us, even after the resurrection, a resurrection that the Christian faith says that we will all experience at some point in the coming years. What must be learned, and where we are to meet God as well, is on this side of eternity. At least to begin with, we'll meet God on the other side, don't get me wrong. And the way we humans learn and grow is through our interaction with each other, our friendships, even our conflicts with others. I've often said this, and I'm really going out of my sermon, but I actually fundamentally believe this. The church, you gathered here on this Sunday morning at 9 a.m., is the only place in our lives where we actually gather to learn two different things, the most important things. The first is to love God. The second thing is to love each other. There's great Kiwanis clubs. There are wonderful clubs out there doing great things, sometimes more so than even the church. But in none of those other situations are they asking us to learn to love God and to learn to love each other. It's the only place in our lives where we gather to do such a thing, the work of love. It's hard work, right? It's hard work to do that. But that's what makes the church special and different, and unlike any other community organization you will ever be a part of, all of which do great good. As I said, sometimes work even better than the church. But whatever that interaction with each other, it's always still human interaction. And because of that reality, God has chosen the human, the way of the flesh and blood, as a means to meet each other, right? To greet each other in this world, by which to reach us, right? Indeed, Jesus, after showing his humanity to his startled disciples, he sends those particular humans out into the world to tell the good news that the divine experience in that human body will be the very thing that sets the entire world free from sin and death, Indeed, as Jesus says here, we are witnesses to these things, the importance of the connection with each other as a way that we will learn to know God and to know of God and to love God and then hopefully love each other. Now, some have said that we cannot save what we do not become. Some have said that we cannot save what we do not become. That we cannot rescue others if we cannot imagine ourselves on the other end of that act of rescue. And that is what makes us human. That sense of empathy, that sense of being with and standing with is what makes us able to care for each other because we have some sense of what the other person is going through. Never completely, of course. All pain is particular pain, and all pain is universal pain. That's the truth of it. That is what makes the friendship between those women from Ames so beautiful. They had these deep human connections to each other, and those connections became the way they learned deep and valuable lessons that can only come through journeying with other human beings. Even the folks we struggle with, folks. And I got some folks I struggle with. I got some folks. You got some folks? We got some folks, right? That we struggle with. The ones whom we wonder whether or not we could see ourselves in their shoes. How could somebody, I got somebody right now in my life, I'm like, how could you do this? How could you not think of how inappropriate all this is? And I've just got to try to reimagine what they're trying. I can't completely. I'm trying to see it from their point of view. But it's a struggle. But that's the work. That's the work. In an Easter sermon at Trinity Church in Boston, the Reverend Pamela Foster, who I always steal with, but I'm giving credit to, discusses what it means to be an Easter people. And she writes this. You know this story, right? From Hotel Rwanda. Anybody remember that powerful story some years ago about the Hutus and the Tutsis fighting with each other, one massacring the other tribe in Africa, set up, sadly enough, by colonialists who decided tall black people were the most valuable, shorter black people were not, set up these two tribes and set them up against each other, and it all comes to a head. Now, Mr. Paul Rusambani, and I'm probably not saying that, is the former manager of a Hotel Rwanda. In the midst of that Rwanda genocide, with great risk to himself, he was able to convince the Hutu authorities to leave unharmed for longer than anyone would imagine the Tutsi people who had taken refuge in that hotel. That shaky agreement made possible some safe passages, convoys that otherwise would have never occurred. In an interview, he said, Paul did, how he had been able to convince the authorities to grant that precarious asylum. And in his reply, he spoke the following sentence. Even the hardest heart has a part that is soft. He is one man. We are an Easter people. Even the hardest part has a part that is soft. So true. Something learned from his experience, and that human truth is what makes judgments about people so difficult, right? I'm struggling not to judge my brother. Let me own it. That's what makes it so difficult. And what a gift it really is for us not to be the ultimate judge of each other. It was always God's gift to say, nope, don't do judgment, I'll take that. It's a hard thing to sit in judgment of other human beings, but boy, we want to play God all the time. What Easter people do is to choose to involve themselves in a world that sometimes seems harder and harder to take a chance on, and they make that choice repeatedly because of the choices that God made in us, made in showing us what love looked like in Jesus, and that Jesus of Nazareth thousands of years ago. You see, we Easter people, we incarnate in our best moments, of course, right? We make flesh God's love, God's care for each other. Just places like Salem Hetzel's, in your best moments. We show each other our wounds. We take a chance that our stories of healing will help others heal as well. Around the time that Zaslows wrote that book, I remember hearing on the radio that one of the women from Ames, the one whose friendship I just shared with you, she was the one who wrote, Jenny was the one who wrote to Jerry Zaslow about that friendship, that group of friendships. She was struggling with breast cancer. But she wasn't the first person from that group who had to deal with breast cancer. Indeed, the first person she called was the other woman who had just beaten breast cancer in her own life. We Easter people, like Christ, we show each other our wounds so that when they become scars, we will be able to recognize the resurrection that we have just experienced, and we will be able to give hope to each other. And I think of those women who have had mastectomies who often will show each other the scars of a breast removed. The doctrine of the incarnation of God in Christ, however you want to interpret the wildness of the doctrine, the craziness of the idea, and I believe it, but it's a wild idea, folks, right? I think it's just simply the attempt by us Christians to come and to name what we already know, that we love and learn with and through each other. And it should be no surprise at all that God is willing to reach us right where we are at. Indeed, it is the most wonderful, wonderful thing in the world to know that the God we journey with, the God who is beside us, has loved us so deeply as to meet us in that one place, that one space, where we know that we can touch the face, the ears, the cheeks, the wounded breasts, the hands of God. And that space, that place, is actually in each other. In the same space that we find Jesus, showing his scars to his friends, knowing that these wounds will be the very means by which they will be healed. Indeed, the very means by which we will all be healed. Amen. Friends, join me in prayer.